Adrian checked his phone again. He'd already scrolled through his feed 3 times since waking up, yet the urge hadn't dulled. Notifications blinked from the corner of the screen. Likes, comments, responses to something personal he'd shared the night before. It was a story he hadn't told anyone in person, a moment of fear, of sadness, of doubt. And the comments, they were kind. Some said, "This is so brave." Others said, "Thank you for being vulnerable." But as his thumb hovered above each heart-shaped response, a dull ache sat in his chest. Why didn't it feel like enough? Outside, rain whispered against the window. The grey light of early morning pressed softly into the room, but Adrian barely noticed. He was still staring at the glowing rectangle in his hand. The post was doing well, maybe even better than he expected. So why did it leave him feeling exposed, even hollow? He set the phone down, but the silence that followed didn't comfort him. It unnerved him. There was a time when being praised for sharing openly made him feel connected. He remembered one friend saying, "You're so real. It's refreshing." But over time, the refreshing turned repetitive, like a wound he kept showing to prove he was healing, only to keep it fresh. He reached for the phone again, reflex. He started typing a new post. Something reflective, maybe a follow-up to last night's. Something about growth, about pain, about learning to let go. His fingers moved fast at first, then slower, then stopped. He stared at the blinking cursor, a sentence half finished, an idea already draining him. His breath fogged lightly against the screen. The words weren't flowing, they were forcing. They weren't building anything, they were breaking something down. Again. He highlighted the text, tapped delete, and let the phone fall gently beside his coffee mug. It was cold. The room around him was still. The city outside moved without needing his voice, his updates, his interpretation of the moment. It was a strange kind of quiet, one that felt both threatening and sacred. He looked out the window. The street lamp flickered. His reflection hovered faintly in the glass, layered over wet concrete and parked cars. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't think about how this moment could be shared. He thought about how this moment could simply be lived. He leaned back in his chair. The breath he hadn't realized he was holding slipped out slowly, as if it too had been waiting for permission to rest. Somewhere in his mind, a voice echoed. Not his, not new. Silence is safer than speech. He couldn't recall exactly where he'd read it. Perhaps Epictetus, perhaps one of those quotes he used to repost without fully absorbing. But now it landed. It wasn't about hiding. It was about holding. It was about preserving something sacred, unshared. He stood and walked to the kitchen, the floor cool beneath his feet, poured fresh water into the kettle. No music, no podcast, just the quiet sound of a flame catching, the water beginning to heat. It was a small moment, but it felt right. He didn't need to write about it. He didn't need to prove it had meaning. He just needed to feel it. Later, maybe, he'd share something again. But not now, not out of reflex, not out of fear of being forgotten. Adrian returned to his chair, tea in hand, watching steam rise and curl. For once, no words pressed to be let out. And in that space, a thought surfaced. Soft, curious, steady. What if silence felt better than being seen? "You always sound like something's wrong." The words slid across the lunch table with the weight of casual honesty. Adrian looked up from his sandwich. Riley, his co-worker, wasn't even looking at him, just scrolling through emails on her tablet. He forced a smile. "Guess I'm just tired." But the moment didn't pass. It stayed. It repeated. It echoed louder in his head than Riley could have imagined. Always sound like something's wrong. Back at his desk, Adrian opened a blank note on his computer. Not for work, not to post, just for himself. He typed the phrase slowly, like pressing a bruise. He began thinking about the way he spoke. In meetings, he defaulted to sarcasm. Around friends, he led with complaints. With family, it was soft apologies for being busy, being scattered, being late. Even when nothing was actually wrong, he sounded like a man carrying rain clouds in his voice. And people had started to respond in kind, stepping back, offering space, sometimes offering pity, but never offering challenge, never seeing anything beyond what he portrayed. Words, he realized, were not just communication, they were confirmation, mirrors. And lately, he had been polishing the mirror with narratives of stress, fatigue, and tension. No wonder people saw him through that lens. That evening, Adrian sat in the quiet hum of his apartment. He resisted turning on the television. Instead, he opened his journal and wrote a question at the top of the page. What story do my words tell? He began listing phrases he used often. I'm just trying to keep up. It's been a rough week. Honestly, I'm so done. He blinked. Not lies. Not exactly. But not the full truth either. When had his vocabulary become a script of hardship? When had he started confusing venting for vulnerability? He closed the journal and stared at the ceiling. The air was still. In that stillness, another memory surfaced, clearer this time. A quote from Seneca. Speech reveals the state of the soul. What was his soul revealing? Was it really this weary? Or had he just stopped choosing silence long enough to remember what steadiness sounded like? The next day at work, Adrian tried something different. During lunch, when co-workers swapped stories of difficult clients and office gossip, he listened. He smiled. But he didn't add to the pile. He didn't correct them either. He just watched, observed. And something strange happened. The group's energy softened around him. They didn't press him to speak. They didn't seem offended. They just filled the space with their own rhythms. And Adrian realized something. Silence wasn't absence. It was presence, without performance. He went an entire afternoon without making a single comment about stress, not because he wasn't feeling it, but because he wanted to learn what his silence had to say. That night, he opened his journal again. This time, his handwriting was steadier. Words are not neutral. They shape the architecture of who I become. He underlined it twice. Then beneath it, he made a vow. Short. Simple. I will speak less and watch more. It wasn't a retreat. It wasn't a rule. It was a practice, one that would take effort, one that might feel lonely. But in that loneliness, perhaps there was clarity. Perhaps there was strength. Later, as he stepped out onto his balcony, he listened to the quiet chorus of the city, horns in the distance, a siren cutting through wind, the faint rustle of leaves. But underneath it all, he noticed something deeper. His mind wasn't narrating anymore, it was just being, listening, present. He leaned against the railing, letting the cool air settle around him, and for the first time in days he felt like himself, without having to say a word. He wondered what would happen if he listened without waiting to speak. The sky was still navy when Adrian tied his shoelaces. The world hadn't yet stirred. Just the faint groan of heating pipes and the soft crunch of gravel as he stepped outside. No music, no smartwatch metrics, no post waiting to be drafted. Just the street lamps' hum and his own breath curling visibly in the cold air. He began to run. Slowly at first, muscles resisting, lungs waking up. But he didn't push. He wasn't chasing a pace. He was chasing a promise he'd made to himself, move without announcement, change without commentary. The first time he tried this, his fingers twitched toward his phone afterward. The sunrise had been sharp with oranges and golds, worthy of sharing. The caption had already formed in his mind. Something like, "Discipline starts in silence." But he stopped himself, closed the camera, pocketed the thought, and instead of applause, he got something better, a long breath, a subtle smile, stillness. Each morning after, the impulse returned, but a little weaker each time. He began to notice the shift. The runs got easier. His posture steadied. His mind stopped jumping ahead to how something might look and began settling into how it felt. He ran past the corner bakery, still dark, past parked cars covered in frost, past the small hill where kids would sled later in the day, and one morning while jogging past a shop window, he caught his reflection. For a split second he braced himself, habit maybe, to critique, to adjust, to document, but then he surprised himself. He didn't stop, he didn't pose, he just kept running, and smiled. It wasn't pride, it was peace, the kind that came not from proving something but from practicing it, quietly, consistently. Later that day, as he brewed tea, his phone buzzed, a message from a friend. "You've been quiet lately, everything okay?" He stared at the screen. He thought about responding with updates, a few pictures, a rundown of progress. He imagined writing, "Yeah, I've just been working on myself, trying to rebuild some habits." But something in him paused. That pause wasn't fear, it was discernment. He replied simply, "Doing well, just keeping things slow." And that was enough. He didn't need to explain. He didn't need to narrate the process to validate its worth. That evening, Adrian opened his journal. No hashtags, no comments, just ink and a quiet lamp overhead. He wrote, "Progress loses power when it's performed too early. Let the roots grow in the dark, let the strength build in silence." He leaned back in his chair, candlelight dancing along the edge of his desk. Outside, snow had begun to fall, light, unannounced. No one to see it, no need to capture it. It was beautiful even in solitude. And that, Adrian thought, might be the truest kind of growth. For once, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. The coffee shop was too warm. Adrian tugged at the collar of his coat but didn't take it off. Steam drifted upward from his cup, as if the moment needed a signal, a warning. Julia sat across from him, stirring her drink long after the sugar had dissolved. She wasn't smiling. "You've changed," she said. Adrian looked at her. Her tone wasn't cruel. It was careful, edged with confusion more than criticism. "You don't talk like you used to. You don't really share anymore, not even with me." He opened his mouth, then closed it. He hadn't seen this coming. Not like this. Julia had been one of his closest friends. She had held space for his stories before, back when storytelling was a habit, not a drain. But somewhere along the way, silence had become his sanctuary. And now, to her, it looked like distance. He took a sip of his coffee. Bitter. "I've just been quieter," he said. Julia leaned forward. "Yeah, but why? Are you okay? Did something happen?" He thought about explaining, about laying it out. The burnout, the emptiness of applause, the slow discovery that words had become a performance he didn't audition for anymore. He thought about telling her how silence had started to feel like truth, how restraint felt more authentic than reflection filtered through the lens of being understood. But something held him back. Not mistrust, not pride, just clarity. Not every truth is owed. Not every explanation is a bridge. Sometimes the attempt to explain becomes its own form of distortion. Sometimes trying to be understood is the very thing that unravels the piece you've just begun to build. He met her eyes. Soft. Steady. "I'm not hiding," he said gently. "I'm just holding things differently." She blinked. Her expression shifted. Part disappointment, part hurt, part uncertainty. She nodded, but the silence between them didn't feel resolved. Outside, people moved past the window. A couple laughing, a cyclist pausing at the red light, a child tapping on the glass. The world kept moving, it always did. Julia looked down at her cup, then back at him. "I just miss the old you, I guess." Adrian felt a pang, not of guilt, but of grief. He missed parts of that version too, the one who didn't hesitate to pour himself out for connection. But that version had also been tired, fractured, needy, always reaching outward. This version, quiet, restrained, wasn't less connected. He was more rooted. He reached for his coat. "I get that," he said softly. "I really do." He stood, not abruptly, not to flee, but to honor a boundary he hadn't known how to draw before. Julia didn't stop him. She just watched. As he stepped outside, the cold air wrapped around him like a wake-up call. It cut through the emotional static, clarifying everything. He walked slowly, without urgency, letting the moment digest. The pavement was slick with thin frost. Streetlights glimmered in puddles. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel cruel. He felt clean. Somewhere behind his ribs, a quote rose to the surface, clearer now than when he first read it. "Silence honors who you are becoming." Epictetus. It wasn't always about speaking the truth. Sometimes it was about protecting it, letting it mature in quiet soil, letting it grow, even if no one else recognized what was taking root. Adrian turned down a side street. the noise of traffic fading behind him. He wasn't angry, he wasn't defensive. He just didn't want to explain anymore, not to be understood, not to be validated, not to repair discomfort that didn't belong to him. And in that resolve, something shifted. He didn't feel alone, he felt aligned. He had nothing to prove, only something to protect. Snow fell without sound. Slow, deliberate flakes drifting past Adrian's window, like they had nowhere better to be. Inside, the apartment was still. No music played. His phone was off. A single candle flickered near the windowsill, casting a quiet warmth that had nothing to prove. He wrapped his hands around a mug of tea and stood there, watching the snowfall gather. There was no one to share the moment with, no one to narrate it to, and for the first time in years he didn't feel the absence of an audience as loneliness. He felt it as freedom. The shift had been gradual, unseen. He hadn't posted in weeks. His phone rarely lit up now, not because people had stopped caring, but because he had stopped performing. And with every day that passed in silence, his center grew steadier. Today he gave himself the gift of a quiet day. No notifications, no news, no plans. He moved slowly, like he had all the time in the world. He cleaned his kitchen without rushing. He read a few pages of a weathered book on Stoicism. He sat cross-legged on the floor for no reason at all. And he breathed. Not deeply, not dramatically, just enough to notice that he still could. At one point, a knock came at the door. It was Mrs. Renner, his elderly neighbor from down the hall. She didn't speak much English, and he didn't speak her language either. But she held out a small thermos, nodded once and smiled. He accepted it with both hands, nodded back. They stood there for a beat in mutual silence, not awkward, not forced, just human. After she left, he poured the tea into his mug. It was herbal, slightly sweet, unfamiliar. He sat near the candle again and wrote in his journal, "Today I was not known by anyone, yet I felt completely seen." He underlined the sentence, then closed the journal. Later he moved the candle closer to the window, watched the flame dance next to the snowfall, watched the world blur in slow motion. He thought about how many versions of himself he had tried to explain over the years. The overachiever, the honest friend, the deep thinker, the broken one. Each version carefully packaged and offered for approval. But this version, the quiet one, asked nothing, needed no title, no defense. He just was. And somehow, that was more than enough. He walked to the kitchen and rinsed the mug. The tap water hissed softly. Snow continued to fall beyond the pane. His breath moved evenly. Light from the candle stretched gently across the countertop. No applause, no feedback, just presence. He returned to the chair, sat with his spine tall, palms open on his knees. He didn't think of Julia. He didn't think of Riley or past messages or missed conversations. He thought of nothing, really. Only the warmth inside his chest and the clarity that came when noise no longer dictated his worth. He no longer needed to be understood to feel complete. Riley paused at Adrian's desk. She leaned on the divider, coffee in hand, eyes squinting thoughtfully. "You feel different lately," she said. Adrian looked up from his screen, blinking once. He didn't rush to answer. She wasn't fishing for details. It was more of an observation, like someone noticing a change in the weather and remarking on the air. He gave a small smile. "I guess I am." She nodded slowly. "It's good." Calmer. Then she moved on. And that was it. No invitation to explain, no request for a backstory, just a moment acknowledged, then let go. The office moved around him as it always had, keyboards tapping, printers sighing, phones buzzing. But Adrian moved through it differently now. He didn't fill silence just to avoid it. He didn't speak to remind people he was present. He simply was. In meetings, he listened more than he spoke. When he did contribute, his words landed with a weight they hadn't carried before, not because they were louder, but because they were fewer. When someone made a joke at his expense, he didn't fire back or try to soften it. He just smiled, let the moment pass like a breeze, and returned to his work. It wasn't detachment. It was presence, with intention. That evening, Adrian walked home without earbuds. The streetlights had just begun to blink on. Shadows stretched long across the sidewalk. A couple laughed behind him. A siren murmured in the distance. The city hadn't changed, but he had. He passed the old gym he once frequented, the one he used to post about religiously. The glass doors were still fogged, the music still pulsed inside. He didn't feel envy. He didn't feel guilt for not going in. He felt a simple truth. He didn't need to be seen becoming anything. He crossed the street slowly, turned the corner and came to his building. From outside he could see the warm flicker of his window candle, still glowing from earlier that morning. He stopped for a moment and just looked up at it. Still, quiet, familiar. Inside, he boiled water, not out of routine, but because it felt like the right thing to do. He sat at the table without a screen, without a soundtrack, without an urge to narrate. The tea steeped in silence. Their message pinged on his phone, but he didn't reach for it. Instead, he closed his eyes, breathed, and listened. To nothing in particular, to everything. His own rhythm, his own steadiness, his own self, undivided, undisguised. When he opened his eyes, the room was unchanged, yet it felt full, whole. And as he stood and turned out the light, he felt no need to say anything about it. No caption, no story. Just a final breath as he returned to the window one last time and smiled at the flicker behind the glass. In a world full of noise, Adrian had finally become the quiet. The candle burned low behind the window, its flame soft but steady against the night. Outside, snow continued to fall, wordless, weightless, unnoticed by most. But Adrian noticed, and that was enough. In the hush of that moment, he had learned what many spend lifetimes avoiding, that peace is not found in louder voices, but in deeper presence. That silence, when chosen, becomes a form of wisdom, a quiet kind of strength, and maybe today, in your own way, you'll find a moment to let silence speak.